Good morning, afternoon, or evening. Today, our Group 3, is going to present Japan Macroeconomic. Our group consists of me, Alifa Adija, Alizaki Alfaki, and Dafa Royhan. First, we're going to dive after World War II. After Japan surrendered in 1945, ending World War II, the country was controlled by Allied force commanded by the United States, resulting in significant changes. Japan was disarmed, its empire was disbanded, its government was transformed into a democracy, and its economy and educational system were restructured and rebuilt. Thousands of airstrikes, including the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, took years of restoration. After the defeat, a new problem occurred. Japan suffered from a high inflation rate. This was because Japan was paying provisional military expenses, payments for completed orders of military equipment, advance payment, and compensation for losses. To fix the inflation rate, in 1984, the Dodge Plan was launched by Joseph Dodge, a Detroit bank president, with the goal of restoring Japan to full power and eventually removing American assistance from Japan in order to prepare for the Cold War. There were three main objectives in the Dodge Plan, which is first, the budget that was in balance, second, reconstruction in the finance bank, suspensions of new loans, and last is reducing 12 subsidies. After World War II, unemployment was a massive issue. Following World War II, there were 7.6 million soldiers when the military force were disbanded, and the loss of military production and other military related jobs amounted to another 4 million people losing their job. In addition, nearly 1.5 million people were compelled to return to Japan despite leaving overseas, and approximately 13.1 million people were unemployed. Unemployment on a big scale, however, never occurred. This is because in 1947, agriculture employed 80 million people, about 4 million more than before the war, yet the low wage, underemployed problem lingered for decades. However, during this time, Japan hasn't recorded any unemployment rate, so we don't have any graph about underemployment after World War II. Next is the recovery period, which is around 1950s to 1970. The U.S. occupation of Japan brought in a series of reform programs aimed at rebuilding and recovering the shattered country. The collapse of the Zaibatsu land reform and labor democracy were three key reforms initiatives undertaken by American forces. This reform program had a significant impact on the nation's democracy and modernization, as well as its ability to grow. The Dodge Plan and the effect it had from the onset of the Korean War were essential in the revival of the Japanese economy. Between 1950 and 1951, when the Korean War began, global trade expanded by 34%, and several countries, including Japan, saw tremendous economic growth. With the difficulties of reconstruction, Japan production grew by 70%, providing a greater boost to the country's economic recovery more than anything else. Here we can see the GDP growth, inflation rate, and an unemployment rate during recovery period. We have seen the GDP rate has gotten better, and the inflation rate has went down. Next part is going to be explained by Ali Zaki Al-Faki.
Thank you, Alifa. Moving to the first and second oil crisis that occurred in Japan. Because Japan was reliant on oil supplies to fuel its expansion, in October 1973, the first oil crisis that was caused by the Middle Eastern War, it had a tremendous impact on the country's burgeoning economy. Because of this, Japan recorded a negative economic growth in 1974. In the data, this is shown as Japan's real GDP growth, rate decreased to minus 1.2%, while their inflation rate skyrocketed from 11.6% in 1973 to as high as 23.2% in 1974, to 11.7% in the following year, 1975. Following this, Japan also saw an increase in their unemployment rate from 1.4% in 1974 to 1.9% in 1975, causing the country to enter a temporary recession. As the second oil crisis in 1978 commenced, Ino states that efforts were made to change Japan's industrial structure and needs from being energy dependent to energy saving. The Japanese government, on the other hand, was able to keep the economy under control and resume a successful recovery by maintaining stringent monetary regulations. The economy was able to stabilize during the oil crisis because of the government's quick response and the high technological level. Exports of automobiles, electronics, and other goods, which grew at a quicker rate than imports, were important to the recovery. This enabled Japan to successfully turn the tide and overcome their inflation, with the inflation rate growth slowing down in the following years. Moving to the Japan's bubble economy. Following this trend, at the beginning of the 1980s, the yen appreciation in price caused trade imbalances with the Western powers to increase. As a result of this, domestic demand-led growth was achieved with the privatization of Japan's national railways, telegraph, and telephone public corporation. Starting in 1986, Japan experienced what was posthumously known as the bubble economy. This was a golden age for Japan's industry, where Japan's corporate profits were at an all-time high, while their failures were at an all-time low. This caused private investments by companies to increase, causing an increasing demand for plant and equipment. This caused prices of these items to rise, and large-scale urban developments progressed at an extremely fast pace. This can be seen in the graph, where Japan's inflation rate was extremely low, with it being 0.6% in 1986, 0.1% in 1987, and 0.7% in 1988. While their real GDP growth went as high as 6.8% in 1988, while their unemployment rate was at a downwards trend, with it being 2.8% in 1987 and 2.5% in 1988 and 2.3% in 1989. However, the amount of money being invested in the stock and real estate markets were way too high, causing abnormal increases in capital asset values. This caused the economic bubble to eventually pop. Next will be explained by my colleague Dafa.
The collapse of the bubble economy started in 1992. This collapse was marked with steep declines in land prices and marked the start of an economic recession. This can be seen in the real GDP growth rate graph, where there is a downward slope starting from 1991 to 1993. The unemployment rate is also increasing, with it started to increase 2.2% in 1992 to as high as 5.4% in 2002. In the aftermath of this, large amount of bad debt was created in the portfolios of large financial institutions, as they were suffering huge losses due to declining land prices. This all became even worse as the East Asian financial crisis occurred. Starting in Thailand, this crisis affected Japan as well, with their currency decreasing in value. Large banks in Japan began to fail in 1997. As a response to this, the Japanese government began injecting public money into the banking sector to stabilize the economic system. As a result of this, a recovery seemed to begin, with Japan's real GDP growth finally increasing by 2.8% in 2000, and the inflation rate decreased by 0.7%. However, this recovery soon turned out to be a farce, as their recovery was very dependent on foreign demand and their investment in plant and equipment were weak. Thus, the effects of this can be seen in the period of 2001 to 2002, where the real GDP growth plummeted, being 0.4 in 2001 and even 0% in 2002, while the employment rate continued to rise. But all bad things must also come to an end, as Japan started their recovery in 2002. Starting in 2002, Japan made an economic recovery, with them restructuring their financial structures and switching to an economic-centric policy. As you can see in the real GDP growth graph, their real GDP began to grow, although not as much as it did before, with a growth of 1.5% in 2003, 2.2% in 2004, 1.8% in 2005, 1.4% in 2006, and 1.5% in 2007. For their inflation rate, it was quite stable, with it on average not changing at all in this period. The unemployment rate also finally started to recover with a downward slope. But then, the global financial crisis occurred in September 2008. This started with the bankruptcy of the major American securities from the Lehman Brothers. Japan, although not as affected as the USA and Europe, also suffered because of this, as their export-centric policy turned against them. As a sudden economic contraction in the US marked a large drop in the demand for exports from Japan, causing a large drop in production and a sharp rise in unemployment. This can be seen on the graph, as the unemployment rate of Japan increased massively, from 4% in 2008 to 5.1% in 2009. Their real GDP growth rate also suffered because of this, with a minus 1.2% growth rate in 2008 and minus 5.7% growth rate in 2009. The inflation rate deflated rather than inflated. The Japanese economy made a recovery in 2010, increasing its real GDP rate by 4.1%. However, this seemingly quick recovery wouldn't last long. 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami. This event occurred on the 11th of March 2011. This was marked by huge losses in infrastructure. This situation went from bad to worse, as their nuclear power plant in Fukushima created the most severe nuclear accident since Chernobyl. This weakened the Japanese economy recovery, as seen in the graph, where its economy stagnated, not growing at all in 2011. And finally, in order to achieve an end to their deflation and break free from economic stagnation, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe created a three-pronged strategy known as Abenomics. Abenomics was a combination of an aggressive monetary policy, a flexible fiscal policy, and the promotion of private investment. Following this, Japan's economy would make a moderate recovery, as shown in this graph, with their real GDP increasing, averaging about 1% every year. There is a steady decrease in unemployment, and finally some sense of inflation, averaging 0.8% every year. The COVID-19 pandemic, 2020 until now. The COVID-19 pandemic, which started in Wuhan, China, has affected the world economy significantly, and Japan is no exception. This period is marked as an unprecedented economic slowdown by the Ministry of Internal Affairs, and the effects of it can be seen in these graphs. 2020 was marked by an intense economic recession, with Japan's real GDP growth decreasing by 4.6%. Japan, as well as other countries, are now in its recovery period, and the future of Japan's economy remains to be seen. So these are our overall graphs from 1960 to 2020. These are our references. So thank you for watching our video, and I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you.